I was cleaning the marble floors of the Riverside mansion when I heard Mr. Davidson speaking Arabic to his guests in the study. His voice carried that familiar tone of superiority, the one he used when he wanted to impress people with his supposed worldliness. What he didn't know was that I understood every single word he was saying about me. You see, while everyone in that house saw me as just another domestic worker, I had spent 4 years studying international relations at Cairo University before circumstances forced me to take this job. But sometimes, the universe has a funny way of setting things straight. Mr. Davidson was telling his business associates in Arabic how stupid American workers were, how he could pay them pennies, and they'd never know the difference because they couldn't understand proper languages. He was laughing about how he'd been shorting my wages for months, calling me a foolish woman who was too dense to notice. His guests were chuckling along, making jokes about how Americans were so monolingual and ignorant. I kept dusting the bookshelf outside the door, my hands steady even though my heart was racing. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since I started working here 6 months ago. I walked into the study with my cleaning supplies, looked directly at Mr. Davidson, and responded in perfect Arabic. I told him that his Arabic was quite good for someone who clearly learned it as an adult, and that I appreciated his honesty about the wage theft. The silence that fell over that room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. His face went from smug confidence to absolute horror in about 3 seconds. His guests stopped laughing and started looking extremely uncomfortable. You could practically hear their thoughts shifting from amusement to embarrassment. Mr. Davidson stammered something about how he was just joking, but I continued speaking in Arabic, mentioning how interesting it was that he felt comfortable discussing illegal wage practices in front of witnesses. I suggested that perhaps we should continue this conversation in English so that everyone could participate equally. The power dynamic in that room shifted so fast it was almost dizzying. One of his guests, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, actually apologized to me in English, saying he had no idea about any wage issues. Another guest excused himself entirely, claiming he had another appointment. Mr. Davidson was left standing there, his carefully constructed image of sophistication crumbling around him. I had been documenting everything, of course. Every shortened paycheck, every snide comment, every instance where he'd spoken about me in Arabic thinking I couldn't understand. I had recordings on my phone from times when he'd had these conversations in common areas. I had photograph evidence of my pay stubs compared to what my contract stated I should be receiving. What Mr. Davidson didn't realize was that I wasn't just some random person who happened to speak Arabic. My father had been a translator for the State Department, and I'd grown up in diplomatic circles where multiple languages were the norm, not the exception. I'd been working as a political analyst before a family crisis brought me back home and forced me to take whatever job I could find to pay for my mother's medical bills. I told Mr. Davidson in Arabic that I would be happy to discuss my findings with the Department of Labor and that I was sure they'd be very interested in his creative accounting methods. I also mentioned that I'd noticed some interesting discrepancies in how he reported his household expenses for tax purposes, information I'd gathered while organizing his office files as part of my duties. The remaining guests were now looking at him with open suspicion. These were business associates who clearly valued their own reputations and didn't want to be associated with someone who was cutting corners with labor law. Mr. Davidson tried to recover by switching to English and offering to resolve any misunderstandings immediately, but the damage was done. His mask had slipped completely, and everyone in that room had seen exactly what kind of person he really was. I continued in English, telling him that I'd be happy to accept the back pay he owed me, plus the overtime compensation I should have received for the many 12-hour days he'd demanded. I also mentioned that I'd be giving my 2 weeks' notice, as I'd recently been accepted for a position with the International Trade Commission that actually valued my language skills and education. The look on his face was priceless. He'd been so convinced of his own superiority that he'd never bothered to actually learn anything about the person he'd been exploiting. He'd made assumptions based on my job title and nothing else. It was a costly mistake. His remaining guests were already heading for the door, making polite excuses about other commitments. I could see them exchanging glances and phone numbers, probably planning to warn other people in their social circle about Mr. Davidson's character. In the business world they moved in, reputation was everything, and his was now seriously damaged. After everyone left, Mr. Davidson tried a different approach. He became apologetic, almost pleading. He offered me a raise if I'd stay, and promised it had all been a misunderstanding. But I'd already made my decision. I'd learned everything I needed to know about his character, and there was no coming back from that. I finished my cleaning duties for the day with a lightness in my step that I hadn't felt in months. The next morning, I filed complaints with the Department of Labor and the IRS, providing all my documentation. I also reached out to the other domestic workers in the neighborhood, sharing information about wage and hour laws that many of them didn't know existed. It turned out that Mr. Davidson wasn't the only wealthy homeowner in the area who thought he could take advantage of workers who might not know their rights. Within a week, 3 other workers had filed complaints against different employers. The local news picked up the story when the Labor Department launched their investigation. The reporter interviewed me about the broader pattern of wage theft affecting domestic workers, and I was able to use my policy background to explain the systemic issues at play. Mr. Davidson's name appeared in the article as one of the employers under investigation. His carefully cultivated image in the community began to crumble as more details emerged. People started questioning how someone could be so careless about legal compliance, especially someone who handled other people's money in his financial services business. The social consequences were swift and brutal. Mr. Davidson found himself uninvited from several important community events. His business started losing clients who didn't want to be associated with someone under investigation for labor violations. His wife, who had always been polite but distant to me, was reportedly furious when she learned that her husband's actions had damaged her own social standing. The house went on the market 2 months later. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they were relocating to another state, supposedly for business reasons. But everyone knew the real reason was that Mr. Davidson had made his position in the community untenable. My story started getting shared on social media by worker advocacy groups. I received messages from other domestic workers who had similar experiences but had never known how to address them. Some had been afraid to speak up because they needed their jobs. Others simply hadn't known that wage theft was illegal or that they had any recourse. I started volunteering with a local organization that provided legal education to domestic workers and immigrants. My language skills and policy background made me an effective advocate, and I found a sense of purpose that had been missing from my work life. The position with the International Trade Commission turned out to be everything I'd hoped for and more. My supervisor specifically mentioned that my real-world experience with labor issues would be valuable in my new role analyzing trade policies affecting worker protections. 6 months later, I received an unexpected call from one of Mr. Davidson's former business associates, the man who had apologized to me that day in the study. He was calling to offer me a consulting position with his company, helping them develop better labor practices for their international operations. He said he'd been impressed by how I'd handled the situation and by the subsequent news coverage of the worker advocacy work I'd been doing. The irony wasn't lost on me that Mr. Davidson's attempt to humiliate me had actually created a network of professional opportunities I never would have had otherwise. Sometimes the universe really does have a sense of justice. The consulting work led to speaking engagements at conferences about international labor standards. I found myself in the strange position of being somewhat of an expert on domestic worker rights, not because I'd planned it, but because I'd lived it and had the educational background to understand the policy implications. Mr. Davidson had inadvertently launched my career in a direction I'd never considered, but that felt deeply meaningful. I still think about that moment of silence in his study sometimes, the look of absolute shock on his face when he realized that his victim had been aware of everything all along. It wasn't just about the language barrier he'd assumed existed. It was about all the assumptions he'd made about who I was and what I was capable of understanding. He'd been so confident in his superiority that he'd never considered the possibility that the person he was exploiting might be more educated, more connected, and more capable than he'd bothered to discover. The last I heard, Mr. Davidson was working for someone else's financial services firm in another state, no longer the master of his own professional universe. His former clients had mostly moved their business elsewhere, and his reputation in financial circles had been permanently damaged. Meanwhile, I was building a career, helping to shape international trade policies that protect workers like I used to be. The whole experience taught me something important about power and assumptions. People like Mr. Davidson maintain their position by convincing others and themselves that they're inherently superior. But that superiority is often built on nothing more than circumstance and the willingness to exploit others. When someone calls their bluff, the entire structure can collapse remarkably quickly. I never intended to become a labor rights advocate. I was just trying to pay my mother's medical bills and get through a difficult period in my life. But sometimes life pushes you toward your true purpose in unexpected ways. And sometimes the people who try to diminish you end up being the ones who reveal your real strength.